What's up guys, this is Yo-Yo. In the previous video, I mentioned when you try to get the right exposure for your video, you can use the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. I discovered that many people may not fully understand why, so in this video, I'm gonna dive into this topic to explain why you can rely on them. In photography, you may be familiar with the concept called exposure triangle, which like this. It means to control your photo exposure, you can adjust these three parameters: aperture, shutter, and ISO. While in videography or cinematography, things work differently because videos are moving images. It requires consistency, and lots of photographers' concepts like the exposure triangle don't work in this way. You need to be aware of this if you shoot videos. Let's break it down with the aperture first. Indeed, you can change the aperture to control how much light you want to get through the lens, but most of the time, you like to choose a specific aperture to shoot. Bokeh is one of the reasons. To create a nice bokeh, you need a shallow depth of field brought by a larger aperture, especially when you shoot sunny outside. You don't want to close the aperture to knock down the lights because you will lose the bokeh if you do so. Using neutral density filters is the way most professionals will do to reduce the light. You see, the aperture is not a really effective way to control your exposure in this case. Rather, it more looks like you just want to pick one for an aesthetic reason. Believe it or not, this is true. If you had a chance to dig a little deeper into the Hollywood cinematography, you will find many cinematographers like to stick on one or two apertures unless for an aesthetic purpose. I discovered that 2.8 and 4 are the frequent choices for those professional cinematographers. That has a reason. Pretty much any lens will reach its max sharpness and minimum chromatic aberration when its aperture is close down to 4 or 5.6. Sharpness usually starts going down when passing 8, and some lens has ghosting which appears after 8 or 11. Also, the dust on your lens or sensor becomes noticeable when the aperture is closed down to 11 and after. So I rarely see people shooting videos with an aperture smaller than 8. In my opinion, 2.8 is relatively a sweet spot to balance the bokeh and sharpness. It provides a pleasing shallow depth of field and sharp enough to deliver a good image for Super 35 sensor. Another interesting reason is that when you use 2.8 with ISO 400 to shoot, the required volume of light measured in foot candles equals the frame rate. In other words, if you shoot 24 FPS, you will need 24 foot candles of light to get the right exposure for your subject. If you shoot 48 FPS, you will need 48 foot candles. The advantage of knowing this detail is that I can easily calculate my lighting setup before I start striking the lights. I feel all the parameters are under control in this way, and I don't have to constantly use my light meters to trick the lighting or keep checking my waveforms to make sure I hit the right spot. If I want to tweak something, it's very flexible because I know exactly how much I need to change. If you're not familiar with foot candles or using those light meters, stay tuned and I'll talk about it in the future videos. So that's the reason I think the pros like to choose 2.8 and 4. In my previous video, I mentioned you couldn't change the shutter speed because you need to use the 180-degree shutter rules to achieve the cinematic motion blur. During the time when movies were shot on a film, the camera shutter, called the shutter angle then, was set actually beforehand. The shutter is a semicircular rotating disc in front of the film gate. Unlike the shutter on the digital camera, which you can adjust touch screen or turning the dial, the disc shutter cannot be changed that easily. It's a mechanism and you have to remove the lens and do it manually. So we have to set it before you shoot. And the reason the shutter was designed in the film camera is to prevent mirroring images as the film is advanced through the camera. Otherwise, you will see your films all have the vertical blur caused by the movements. So the rotating disc was put inside to make sure the film is steady when the light hits in. And when it blocks the light, the frame goes away and the next frame goes in. The movement here won't be exposed. The shutter in the motion picture camera has never been a way to change exposure. The primary reason is that cinematographers adjust the shutter angle is just to control the amount of motion blur that's recorded on the film. Digital cameras, especially those hybrid cameras, don't have the shutter angle. They have the regular shutter speed which derives from the photography cameras. In this case, you need to convert the shutter angle to shutter speed. The formula is this. Through a simple calculation, you know the shutter speed would be twice your frame rate to achieve the same effect of a 180-degree shutter angle. This can be seen easily on the true cinema camera like my red here. When you set the shutter angle, you won't change it no matter what frame rate you choose. And when you choose different frame rates, you can see the shutter angle stays the same, but exposure changes. In this case, it gets darker. It means the shutter speed was changed. So remember, you change the shutter just for a different motion blur, but never for the exposure. The last one on the exposure triangle is the ISO, which is actually the only parameters that you can use to change the exposure, but do not overuse it. To explain this, we need to talk about the concept of ISO in digital cameras. The ISO was used to identify the film speed, which is the measure of a film stock sensitivity to light. Here's a little trivia. Did you know ISO is actually a combination of two measuring systems? The ASA and DIN. That's why you can see two numbers on the old film rolls. Through the years, people had kept calling the first number and totally forgot the latter one. So the ISO became the only number in the front, the ASA number. And that's true, people just feel too bothered to call them both and ditch one. So today, the ISO is the ASA, and that's why Hollywood cinematographers always call it ASA. They're actually the same thing. When the digital photography camera was invented, the ISO was introduced into the system to give people a universal standard. Because when you want to get the same result by using different lenses and setup, you need to calculate the light. To calculate the light, you have to involve the ISO to get the right reading. But here you should know, the ISO in the digital camera is not the same one in the film. The digital sensor usually has only one sensitivity. Some of them have two, like those ones Sony dual-base ISO sensors. After capturing the image, a pose adjustment was applied to the raw data. This pose adjustment is actually the ISO. When you increase the ISO, you are actually changing the pose adjustment to amplify the raw data. If you amplify too much, artifacts will appear, and those artifacts are usually color noises. If there's no pose adjustment applied, the images is processed from the sensor original sensitivity. In this case, the original sensitivity is the native ISO of the sensor, which generates the least artifacts. That's why when you shoot RAW, you can freely change the ISO because it's just a pose adjustment. And if you use Japanese brand video camera, you can see they use term gain to refer to the sensitivity. If the gain is 0, it means you are using the native ISO. If you shoot photos, when you change the ISO, it seems it's not like a big deal. But if you shoot videos, as the noises become lively, you should definitely consider using the native ISO to shoot. That's why you can't use the ISO to change the exposure. You want to stick to the native ISO as much as possible. The good news is modern cinema cameras have a native ISO range. It allows you to choose the ISO in this range where noises are well controlled. This is obviously on my 300 Mark II, which I can rank it up like 3200 without noticeable noises if properly lit. On the contrary, I have to bring my red again. This camera, my Red Dragon, will start having noises after 800, which is a notorious flaw of the RAW sensor. Even they claim its base ISO is 800. But my Red produced way cinematic images than 300, C300. So we have to treat it differently. The reality is if you change the ISO no more than one step higher than the native, it should be no problem. But the test is needed. For serious filmmakers, they want the cleanest footages to achieve the best quality. Okay, I hope I explained this topic to you well. Since the triangle doesn't quite work on video, other methods need to get involved. ND filter is one of them. So in the next video, I will share some insights on how to use filters. Stay tuned and see you in the next video. Bye-bye.